The field report said the Veshtari warpack had been killed in the bombardment. Sergeant Major Cade Marin read the line twice on the transport's display, then closed the file and watched the forest canopy below instead. The report was wrong. He knew it was wrong because the thermal sweep he had pulled from the ground team's last relay showed 19 distinct heat signatures in the ravine. Signatures too large and too hot to be anything except Veshtari dragons, alive and in distress. Nobody back at Forward, operating base Talon, cared whether the signatures were alive or dead. The bombardment had been ordered to clear the Veshtari gorge for a mining access road. The second plasma strike in as many months on land that had been protected habitat until the Survey Revision Board quietly reclassified it. The dragons were listed as hostile fauna in the operational brief. The report's purpose was to confirm clearance, not accuracy. But Cade had spent 26 years reading thermal scans in theaters considerably worse than this, and what he saw in that sweep was not a cleared gorge. It was a wounded pack hiding from the species that had just tried to kill them. He had been assigned to the Conservation Liaison Office 3 months ago, after the incident at Brecon Pass. The incident that had ended his combat career. The incident that had started the disciplinary review, the investigation, the 3 weeks of mandatory psychiatric evaluation, and the transfer that eventually, mercifully, dead-ended into a billet nobody wanted and nobody supervised. Conservation Liaison was where the military sent soldiers it could not court-martial and could not promote. The soldiers who had done something that was technically illegal and obviously right, and whom the institution preferred to forget rather than punish publicly. Cade understood the math. He was 49. His left knee was rebuilt with titanium pins from a dropship landing that had gone bad in his 30s. His hearing was damaged from a breaching charge 8 years ago, and his personnel file carried a flag that read insubordination, mitigating circumstances. The mitigating circumstances were that he had refused to fire on a nesting site during a clearing operation at Brecon Pass. The insubordination was that he had physically blocked the fire team's line of sight, standing in front of their weapons with his arms at his sides, until the fledglings cleared the ridge. 7 minutes. He had counted them. The longest 7 minutes of his life, with plasma barrels aimed at the rock face behind him, and 5 terrified young dragons scrambling over the crest. He had not regretted it. He had not apologized for it. His commanding officer had stared at him in the debriefing room and said, "You understand this ends your career?" And Cade had said, "Yes, sir," and meant it the way a man means anything he has already paid for before it is asked. Now he was in a transport heading for a ravine where 19 heat signatures said the bombardment had failed, and the only person on the entire base who seemed to care was the man the institution had already decided to forget. The transport set down in a clearing half a kilometer from the gorge's western lip. Cade stepped out into air that tasted of ash and sulfur, the residual chemistry of plasma bombardment mixing with the forest's natural terpene fog. The trees here were enormous, trunks wider than the transport, bark the color of dried blood, canopy so dense that the daylight filtered down in gold-green shafts thick enough to walk through. Fungal shelves the size of tabletops grew from the trunks at head height, their undersides spotted with bioluminescent spores that flickered faintly even in daylight. The Veshtari Gorge was one of 7 protected ravines in the northern range, or it had been, until the mining survey reclassified the region 6 months ago and the protections were quietly revoked. He shouldered his medic pack, the conservation version, loaded with burn gel, bone splint sized for draconic anatomy, nutrient paste rated for obligate carnivore metabolisms, a portable thermal scanner he had calibrated himself, and suture kits he had modified with longer needles, and started walking. The gorge opened below him like a wound in the forest floor. 300 meters deep, walls of black basalt streaked with mineral veins that glowed faintly amber in the daylight, heated by the same geothermal system that had made this valley a nesting site for over a millennium. The bombardment had scored the upper rim. Blast craters pocked the stone. Shattered trees lay in jackstraw tangles across the lip, their root systems torn from the thin soil and hanging into the void like grasping fingers. But the ravine itself was mostly intact. The plasma rounds had hit the canopy and the rim. They had not penetrated to the floor. The pack was down there. Cade found a descent path along the gorge's eastern face, a series of natural ledges where centuries of dragon claws had worn the basalt into rough steps, each groove deep enough to hold his boot. He descended slowly. His knee complained on every drop, sending sharp reminders up through his thigh that the titanium pins were doing the work his cartilage no longer could. The air cooled as he went down, then warmed again near the bottom, where the geothermal vents that made the Veshtari Gorge a nesting site pushed heat through cracks in the stone floor. The warmth rose around his legs like wading into still water. He smelled them before he saw them. The musk of stressed dragons is unmistakable, a sharp, metallic tang layered under something older and more organic, like heated stone and scorched bone marrow. The smell of a creature whose internal body temperature runs hot enough to char its own shed scales, and who, when frightened, vents that heat in waves that shimmer the air like a mirage. The pack was gathered in the widest section of the gorge floor, where a shallow thermal pool steamed between slabs of fallen basalt. 19 dragons. The report had been wrong about their deaths and right about their count. They were Veshtari Ridge Runners, the last wild pack in the northern range, a lineage that the conservation database traced back 1,400 years to the first nesting records kept by the dragon clans themselves. Deep green scales edged in copper, heavy jaw ridges with the double-crested bone structure unique to the northern subspecies. Wing membranes thick enough to shed rain, veined with capillaries that flushed crimson when the dragon was stressed or in pain. The largest was a female, 7 meters from snout to tail tip. Her body curled around a cluster of younger dragons who pressed against her flanks with the desperate, tight-wound energy of creatures who had recently been terrified and were not yet done being afraid. Her scales bore the rich, deep green of a mature Veshtari, but along her left flank and shoulder the color was wrong, patches of gray-white where the pigment had been bleached by proximity to plasma heat. Old burns, healed but scarred, hidden under the overlap of her dorsal plates. She had survived a bombardment before. This was not the first time someone had tried to clear this gorge. 3 of the pack were injured badly enough that Cade could see it from 60 meters. A subadult held her right wing at the wrong angle, the joint swollen, the membrane torn along the trailing edge where the tissue was thinnest. An older male had a wet gleam of exposed tissue where scales had been stripped from his shoulder by blast concussion, the wound weeping clear fluid that caught the light. And a mid-sized male lay on his side near the thermal pool with his breathing too fast and too shallow, his ribs moving in the stuttered rhythm of a compromised air sac. Each exhale carried a thin whistle that echoed faintly in the gorge, the sound of a puncture losing pressure. Cade stopped walking. He set the medic pack down on the warm stone. He sat on a flat slab, rested his hands on his knees, palms up, and waited. This was the part that no manual taught and no briefing prepared you for. You did not approach a wounded dragon pack. You did not call to them, gesture to them, or move toward them with purpose. A wounded dragon pack approached you, or it killed you, or you sat until your legs went numb and your back seized and the pack decided, in its own time and by its own calculus, that you were furniture rather than a threat. Those were the 3 options, and you could not influence which one arrived. Cade had learned this lesson at Brecon Pass, standing in front of a fire team while fledglings scrambled over a ridge behind him. He had learned it again in the rehabilitation facility afterward, reading everything the Conservation Service had published about dragon behavioral thresholds, while his disciplinary hearing moved at the speed of bureaucratic indifference. And he had learned it from Warden Ash Sellen, who had kept the Thornwall breeding station for 40 years before it was decommissioned, and who had told him over a static-filled radio call from his retirement, The dragon doesn't need to trust you. It needs to decide that you're not interesting enough to kill. That's the first step. Trust comes later, and it comes all at once, like a door opening. 20 minutes passed. The afternoon light shifted in the gorge, the amber mineral veins in the walls brightening as the sun angle changed. Insects droned in the warm air above the thermal pool. A fledgling sneezed, a small, percussive burst of heat that singed a patch of moss on the stone beside it. The matriarch lifted her head. She fixed Cade with eyes the color of molten copper, irises contracting to vertical slits in the daylight. A low vibration rolled through the gorge floor, subsonic, felt in the chest and the teeth more than heard. The stone under Cade's legs hummed with it. A warning. A statement. I see you, and I am deciding. Cade did not move. He breathed steadily. He kept his hands visible on his knees, palms up, fingers open. He looked at her, held her gaze for 2 seconds, then deliberately looked away, the dragon behavioral equivalent of lowering your weapon and turning your shoulder. I am not a threat. I am not interested in dominance. I am sitting here, and I will continue to sit here. Another 10 minutes. The matriarch's pupils dilated slightly. The subsonic vibration faded from the stone, leaving a residual warmth like the memory of a sound. Small dragon, a juvenile, maybe 3 years old, her scales a mottled green-brown that had not yet developed the copper edging of the adults, separated from the cluster against the matriarch's flank. She took 3 careful steps toward Cade. Stopped. Her head tilted, the double-crested jaw ridge catching the light. 2 more steps. Her nostrils flared wide, pulling his scent in long, deliberate draws, cataloging what he was and what he carried, and whether either of those things constituted food or danger. Cade opened the medic pack slowly. No sudden movements. He pulled out a nutrient bar, compressed protein with bone calcium supplements, the same base formula the Conservation Service used for rehabilitation feeding programs. He broke it in half with a clean snap, set one piece on the stone between them, and placed his hands back on his knees. The juvenile looked at the food, looked at him, looked back at the matriarch, who had not moved but whose copper eyes tracked every motion with the precision of a creature that processes visual information 3 times faster than a human can blink. The juvenile took the nutrient bar. She snatched it fast, the way a wild animal takes food from an untested source. Grab and retreat, 2 meters back, crouched low with the bar clamped in her jaws. She ate it in 3 bites, bones and all, her jaw muscles working with a grinding efficiency that would have reduced Cade's hand to a collection of disconnected fingers in about 2 seconds. Then she came back. Cade set down the other half. She took it more slowly this time. 1 step forward, a long sniff of the stone where his hand had rested, and then the food. She ate it where she stood, less than a meter from his knee, and when she finished she looked at him with the calm, evaluative stillness of a creature that had adjusted its threat assessment and filed the result. After that the work began. Over the next 8 days, Cade fell into a rhythm that his body remembered from every field deployment he had ever served, the cadence of sustained, purposeful labor that left no room for doubt or hesitation. He descended into the gorge each morning at first light, before the heat of the day drove the pack deeper into the shade of the thermal vents. He started with the juvenile, the one he was already thinking of as tall, after the quick, decisive rhythm of her gait, because she was the one who had eaten from his hand, and in pack dynamics, the first to accept contact became the bridge. He fed her, then the other juveniles, who approached in 2s and 3s once they saw Tal eating without consequence. Then the subadults, who came not for food but for proximity, standing 5 meters away, watching him work, their heads tilted in the evaluative posture that dragons use when they are processing something they do not yet understand. The matriarch watched everything. She did not approach. She did not eat from his hand. But on the 3rd day she shifted her position so that her body was oriented toward him rather than away, and the subsonic vibration she had used as a warning on the 1st day changed. The same frequency, lower amplitude, sustained rather than pulsed. Not a warning, an observation. I am still watching. I have not decided against you. The injured male was his most critical patient. Cade named him Keth. The syllable had come to him unbidden, clicking into place the way names sometimes do when you spend enough time watching a creature breathe. Keth had a pneumothorax, air trapped between his chest wall and his left air sac, compressing the tissue with every breath and reducing his respiratory capacity to a fraction of what a healthy dragon needed. The thin whistle Cade had heard on the first day was not improving. It was getting worse. On the fourth day, Cade sat 3 meters from Keth and laid out his surgical tools on a sterilized field cloth. He did this slowly, deliberately, letting Keth see each instrument, letting him catalog the shapes and the smells. A drainage catheter, antiseptic solution. A scalpel modified with a longer blade to reach between dragon ribs. Local anesthetic and a dosage. He had calculated based on Keth's estimated body mass, cross-referencing the Conservation Service's veterinary dosing tables with the field notes of every dragon medic, whose reports he had been able to access in 3 months of obsessive reading. Keth watched him with amber eyes. His breathing was getting worse, the whistle louder, the pauses between exhales longer. He knew he was in trouble. Cade had seen that look in human patients, the awareness of declining function, the calculation of whether the creature in front of you was more dangerous than the thing already killing you. Cade spoke to him. Not words that Keth could understand. Dragons processed human speech as tonal texture, not language, but the cadence mattered. Low, steady, rhythmic. The same vocal pattern that conservation manuals described as non-threatening sustained vocalization, and that Cade, privately, thought of as talking to someone who is deciding whether to let you save their life. You've got air in the wrong place, Keth, between the wall and the sac. It's pressing on the tissue and making it harder to breathe, and it's going to keep getting harder. I can fix it, but I need to get close, and I need you to hold still, and that's a lot to ask from someone who has every reason to burn me where I sit. Keth's pupils contracted, his nostrils flared. A thin tendril of heat shimmer rose from his jaw, the involuntary thermal venting of a stressed dragon, the physiological precursor to flame. Cade did not back away. He held Keth's gaze for 2 heartbeats, then looked deliberately at the surgical tools, then back. I am showing you what I intend to do. I am not hiding anything. The decision is yours. 3 minutes of silence. The gorge walls reflected the afternoon light in amber bands. The other dragons watched from the thermal pool, motionless, a tableau of creatures who understood that something was being negotiated. Keth lowered his head. Not submission, a dragon does not submit. Permission. The distinction matters because a creature that submits has been defeated, and a creature that permits has made a choice. And the second thing is the foundation on which every genuine bond is built. Cade moved in slowly. He administered the anesthetic with the same hands that had stabilized human soldiers in triage units under fire, the same practiced calm that 26 years had wired into his nervous system below the level of conscious thought. He found the puncture site between the 4th and 5th ribs, a small tear in the pleural membrane where blast concussion had driven a fragment of scale inward. He inserted the drainage catheter, felt the rush of trapped air escaping, watched Keth's breathing change within seconds. The whistle fading, the rib movement deepening, the rhythm steadying from the panicked flutter of a drowning creature to the deep, slow cadence of an animal that could suddenly breathe. Keth's head came up. His eyes were wide. He took 3 deep breaths, the kind of breaths that test a new capacity, that explore the recovered space inside a body, and on the 3rd breath he made a sound. Not a growl, not a hiss, not the subsonic vibration the Matriarch used. A single, clear tone, rising and sustained, resonant enough to hum in the basalt walls. A note of pure relief that rang through the gorge like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. The Matriarch answered it. A deeper note, lower, harmonized. The two tones braided together and filled the ravine with a sound that Cade felt in the bones of his jaw, in the titanium pins in his knee, in the spaces between his ribs where his own breathing had gone very still. He finished the procedure with steady hands, applied antiseptic, splinted Keth's ribcage with flexible polymer braces he had modified to accommodate draconic anatomy, longer, curved, with thermal-resistant padding at the contact points. Checked the drainage valve, cleaned and packed his tools while Keth lay on the warm stone, breathing properly for the first time in days, and watched him with an expression that Cade, who had spent a career learning not to anthropomorphize, could only describe as gratitude. On the 5th morning, the matriarch came to him. He was sitting on the flat slab he had adopted as his station, sorting nutrient supplements into daily doses, when the ground vibrated and a shadow blocked the light. She was enormous up close. Her head alone was the size of the slab he sat on, her copper eyes level with his from a distance of 2 meters. She smelled of heated stone and old fire, and the particular mineral sweetness of a dragon who has been soaking in thermal springs. She extended her neck and touched her snout to his chest. The contact was precise, deliberate, the tip of her nose against his sternum, held for 3 seconds. A gesture that the conservation literature described as scent bonding initiation, and that Warden Sellon in his field notes had described simply as, she chose him. Then she hummed. The recognition tone, a specific frequency that Veshtari matriarchs use to acknowledge a member of the pack. Not a pet, not a guest, a member. The sound passed through Cade's ribs and settled somewhere behind his heart, and he sat very still and breathed and did not cry, because he was 49 years old and had spent 26 years learning how not to, but it was a near thing. Some things were simple. Some things were also terrifying. The two conditions were not mutually exclusive. The trouble arrived on the 9th day. Cade was climbing into the gorge when his radio crackled. Forward operating base Talon, Major Elias Drace, mining liaison. Marin, your conservation reports are creating problems. The gorge was cleared. I need it to stay cleared. The gorge was not cleared, sir. The pack survived. I've filed accurate status reports. I'm aware of what you filed. I'm telling you to stop filing it. The access road goes through the gorge floor. Survey teams deploy in 9 days. The juveniles were already moving toward him at the bottom of the path, heads bobbing with the eager gait of dragons who associated his arrival with food, and the steady hands that made the pain stop. The pack is 19 animals, sir. Last wild Veshtari in the northern range, heritage lineage, 1,400 years of continuous presence. If survey teams come through, the matriarch will defend the nesting area. People will die. Then move the pack. You can't relocate a bonded wild pack mid-recovery. 3 are still under treatment. 1 has a splinted ribcage and a decompression valve in his air sac. Marin, I'm not asking for a wildlife lecture. Operational directive. 9 days, clear or we clear it again. Drace out. The radio went silent. Cade stood in the gorge with nutrient bars in his pack and a juvenile nudging his hand, and he felt the old weight settle back into his chest, the same weight from Brecon Pass, the same cold clarity that had made him step into a line of fire and say no. The feeling of a man who has already lost everything except the thing directly in front of him. He could not move the pack. He could not fight an armored survey column, but he was not the only one in this gorge with something to lose. Over the next 3 days, he did something that violated every protocol in the conservation manual. He began teaching the pack to trust organized movement, not commands. Dragons do not take commands, and any keeper who tried discovered exactly how much heat a Veshtari matriarch could produce in a closed space. Requests, invitations. He used the old keeper signaling system, body postures, directional walking, subsonic tones replicated through a handheld resonator he had salvaged from the decommissioned breeding station's supply cache 2 months ago. the careful grammar of a language designed to say I am walking this way, and I would like you to walk with me without ever implying I have authority over where you go. The juveniles followed first. They always did. Young dragons are curious and social, and they associated Cade's movement with the likelihood of food appearing. Then Keth, whose healing had progressed enough for him to walk the full gorge length without favoring his left side. His stride was still cautious, each step measured, but the pain had left his gait. His presence drew the subadults, who tracked the breeding-age male the way a security detail tracks a principal, instinctive, positional, concerned primarily with keeping him in sight. The first attempt at corridor transit went badly. Cade led the juveniles into the eastern passage, a narrow gap where the walls closed tight enough that the largest dragons had to fold their wings flat against their bodies, and 70 meters in, the youngest juvenile panicked. The walls pressed close. The daylight narrowed to a strip overhead. The juvenile stopped, whined, a high, distressed note that bounced between the basalt walls and bolted backward, knocking 2 others into a tumbling pile of tails and wings. The chain reaction brought the entire group scrambling back into the main gorge, where they huddled against the Matriarch's flanks and refused to move for 2 hours. Cade sat down in the corridor entrance and waited. When the juveniles calmed, he walked 10 meters into the corridor, set down a nutrient bar, and walked back out. Tal went in and got it. He walked 20 meters in. She followed, 30 meters, 50. By the end of the second day, the juveniles could transit the full 200 meters of the corridor and emerge into the adjacent valley. A valley the mining survey had not reached, still listed as protected habitat in the pre-revision database, still holding the deep-water thermal springs the Veshtari had used as a secondary nesting site for 800 years. The valley was larger than the gorge and open to the sky. Thermal vents lined the southern wall, their heat creating a microclimate where ferns grew chest-high, and the air smelled of mineral water and warm stone. The springs themselves were 3 interconnected pools fed by the same geothermal system, each pool a different temperature. The lowest barely warm, the middle bath hot, the highest pool steaming and mineral-rich, its edges crusted with the calcified deposits that dragons use to supplement their scale growth. The matriarch watched from the thermal pool in the gorge. She watched Cade walk the pack through the corridor each day. She watched the juveniles discover the new valley and come galloping back with the giddy, wing-flapping energy of young dragons finding warm water they had never smelled before. She watched Keth stand at the corridor's far end and call back to her, a low note that resonated through stone. On the 6th day, she stood and walked to the corridor entrance. She looked at Cade. She looked through the passage at the valley beyond, her head tilted slightly, nostrils flared, reading the thermal signature of the springs and the mineral content of the air. She looked back at him. Her copper eyes held the patient, measuring intelligence of a creature that had been making territorial decisions for decades and was making one now. Then she walked through the corridor and the entire pack followed, not because he told them to, because she decided to. Cade spent 2 days establishing the new site. He cleared deadfall from the thermal springs. He checked water temperatures against the Conservation Service's nesting parameters, all within range, the geothermal output steady. He set up a perimeter of motion sensors and cataloged every viable roosting position along the basalt ledges, marking the ones with the best thermal exposure and wind shelter. He mapped 3 escape routes from the valley, 2 overland paths through the forest canopy, and 1 along a dry riverbed that descended toward the lowland plains. If the pack needed to run again, they would have options. He filed a revised conservation report listing the pack's new location and requesting formal redesignation of the corridor as a wildlife transit zone. The request was denied within 4 hours. Major Drace called on the 7th day. The survey team found the corridor, Marin. The mining company wants both valleys now. Your relocation bought you nothing. New timeline 5 days. Cade sat beside the thermal springs. Keth lay beside him, breathing deeply in healthy sleep. The splints were off, new scales growing in darker green along the scar lines. Tal, the juvenile who had first eaten from his hand, whose name he had chosen because its 2 syllables matched the quick, decisive rhythm of her walk, was perched on a boulder above him, wings half spread in the afternoon sun. He looked at the pack, 19 dragons, the last wild Veshtari, alive because he had climbed into a gorge with a medic kit and the stubbornness to sit still. "No," he said into the radio. "Excuse me." "I said no, Major. I will not facilitate clearance of a protected nesting site. I will not relocate a recovering pack into open territory with no thermal resources. I am filing a formal conservation objection with Regional Command and requesting an independent environmental review under Heritage Statute 12. Silence, long enough for Cade to count 5 of Keth's breaths. "You're ending your career, Marin." "My career ended at Brecon Pass, sir. This is just what I do instead." He filed the objection. He knew it would be buried. He filed it anyway, sent copies to every conservation officer in the regional database, to the Heritage Compact Commission, and to Dr. Elara Vast, who ran the Veshtari Heritage Foundation from a converted farmhouse 300 kilometers south, and who had been fighting the mining reclassification for 2 years. While he waited for a response, Cade worked the problem from the inside. He mapped the new valley systematically, every thermal vent, every water source, every potential nesting shelf along the basalt walls. He photographed the pack daily, building a visual record of their recovery. Keth's ribs knitting, the subadult's wing membrane regenerating, the elder's shoulder wound closing under new scales. He documented the matriarch's bond behaviors with timestamps and behavioral codes, every hum, every approach, every instance of sustained eye contact. If this went to a tribunal, he would need evidence that was not his word against a major's. He also started sleeping in the valley. Not in a tent on the stone, wrapped in his field blanket, with his medic pack as a pillow and the warmth of the thermal vents keeping the ground at a steady 18 degrees. The first night, the pack kept its distance. The second night, 2 juveniles settled within arm's reach. By the 4th night, he woke to find Tal curled against his side, her small body radiating heat through the blanket, and Keth lying across the entrance of the rock alcove he had chosen, positioned like a sentry. Not for warmth, but stationed like something that had decided what it was guarding. Cade lay still in the dark, listening to the breathing of dragons, and thought about Brecon Pass, about the 7 minutes, about the look on the fledglings' faces as they scrambled over the ridge, the wild-eyed, panicked faces of creatures who understood exactly what the plasma barrels pointed at the rock behind him could do. He had been profoundly afraid for those 7 minutes, and the fear had been the cleanest thing he had ever felt. Not the fear of dying. He had made peace with that somewhere around minute 3. The fear of not standing there long enough. The fear that his body would override his decision, that the fledglings would still be on the ridge when the fire team's patience ran out. He had not moved. The fledglings had cleared the ridge. And the fire team squad leader had lowered his weapon and said, very quietly, "Sarge, what the hell was that?" And Cade had not had an answer, because the real answer, the one beneath the insubordination charge and the psychiatric evaluation and the transfer to a billet nobody supervised, was that he had looked at 5 young dragons and seen 5 creatures who deserved to make it over a ridge, and he had not been able to find a reason that outweighed that. The same reason he was sleeping on a valley floor with 19 dragons who had decided he was furniture. The same reason he had said no to a major on an open channel. Some things were simple. The difficulty was not in understanding them. The difficulty was in what they cost. Elara arrived on the 8th day in a battered all-terrain vehicle loaded with recording equipment, legal briefs, and a portable satellite uplink. She was 61, gray-haired and sun-weathered, sharp-eyed behind wire-rimmed glasses that she wore pushed up on her forehead more often than on her nose. She had been studying Veshtari pack behavior for longer than Cade had been in the military, and her hands, when she shook his, were as calloused as any field worker's. She walked to the valley's edge, looked down at the pack around the thermal springs, the matriarch resting on the warm stone with one eye open, the juveniles roughhousing in the shallows, Keth alert near the corridor, and was quiet for a long time. "How many?" 19, 4 breeding-age males, 7 juveniles. 2 elders. And the matriarch has accepted you. She lets me treat her, touch her. She shared food with me. She hummed the recognition tone. Elara turned to look at him with an expression he had not expected, not surprise, not professional interest, but something closer to grief. "Do you understand what that means? In 37 years of fieldwork, I have documented 11 instances of a wild Veshtari matriarch extending the recognition tone to a non-dragon. 11. In all of recorded history. You've been here 9 days. I sat still and fed them, that's all." "No, you sat still and they read you. A Veshtari matriarch's thermal sense can detect cortisol changes through the skin at 2 meters. She was measuring your fear response, your aggression markers, your hormonal baseline every time you sat in that gorge. You passed a screening process that most humans don't even know is being administered." She paused. "The recognition tone means she has decided you are pack, not an ally, not a tolerated presence. Pack. That distinction is the difference between a legal curiosity and an Article 9 heritage claim." Cade did not know what Article 9 was. Elara explained it over field rations that evening, while the pack settled into the thermal springs below them, and the sky turned the color of hammered copper. The Heritage Compact, the legal framework that had governed dragon conservation before the mining reclassification, contained a provision that predated the modern legal system by 3 centuries. Article 9 stated that any human recognized by a wild pack matriarch through the formal bond tone became, in the language of the original compact, voice of the pack, a legal representative with standing to challenge territorial reclassification on behalf of the pack itself. The provision had been written when dragon packs and human settlements had coexisted, when the bond between keeper and pack was understood as a mutual relationship rather than a management convenience. It had never been repealed because no one had thought to use it in over 100 years. "The mining reclassification bypassed heritage review," Elara said. "That's been my case for 2 years: procedural violation, insufficient environmental survey, conflict of interest in the review board membership. But I've had no standing because no human had pack recognition. A conservation officer filing objections is bureaucratic noise. A voice of the pack invoking Article 9 is a legal obligation that triggers an independent tribunal." She looked at him steadily over her wire-rimmed glasses. "You understand what this means for you personally?" "It means Drace will try to have me removed before I can file." "It means that, and worse. The mining consortium has spent 14 months and considerable capital securing the reclassification. You are standing between them and a profit margin that extends well beyond one access road. I've stood in front of things before." Elara smiled, a tired, knowing smile that said she had worked with enough stubborn people to recognize the species. "Yes, I read your file. 7 minutes at Brecon Pass." They filed the Article 9 claim at dawn the next morning, transmitted through Elara's satellite uplink to the Heritage Compact Commission, the regional judicial authority, and every conservation organization in the Continental database. The filing named Sergeant Major Cade Marin as voice of the pack for the Veshtari Northern Range Pack, cited the matriarch's recognition tone as documented in Cade's field recordings, and demanded an immediate injunction against the mining survey pending independent environmental review. The response was fast. Within 2 hours, Cade's conservation liaison credentials were revoked. Within 4 hours, Major Drace announced that the survey column would deploy in 2 days rather than 5, citing deteriorating security conditions in the valley region. Within 6 hours, Cade received a formal notice of disciplinary action. His second, charging him with unauthorized legal filings, misuse of conservation authority, and conduct prejudicial to operational objectives. He read the notice sitting on a ledge above the thermal springs while Tal leaned against his left leg and Keth dozed in the afternoon heat below, his breathing strong and even, the drainage catheter removed 3 days ago and the wound healing clean. The matriarch lay in the shallows of the highest pool, her green and copper body half submerged, steam rising around her like incense. She was watching him. She was always watching him. "They're coming in 2 days," he told Elara. "I know. I've filed for an emergency injunction. It won't arrive in time, but it establishes the legal record." She was organizing her recording equipment, 3 cameras, 2 audio capture arrays, the satellite uplink positioned to broadcast live to the Heritage Commission's public archive. "When the survey column arrives, we document everything. Every order, every response, every action. The tribunal will review the footage. And if they come through anyway, then the footage becomes evidence in a criminal proceeding rather than an administrative one." She met his eyes. "I am not going to tell you this will work. I am going to tell you that the legal framework exists, the claim is valid, and the precedent, if we establish it, protects every remaining wild pack on the continent. That is worth standing for." Cade thought about the matriarch's copper eyes, about the recognition tone that had settled behind his ribs, about 19 dragons who had survived 2 bombardments and a species that kept trying to take their home. "Yes," he said. "It is." The morning of the confrontation, Cade woke before dawn to the sound of the matriarch moving. She had risen from the thermal pool and walked to the valley's northern rim, the highest point, where the basalt wall crumbled into a natural overlook facing the direction the survey column would come from. She stood there in the gray pre-dawn light, her silhouette enormous against the brightening sky, her wings half spread in a display posture that Cade had never seen in person, but recognized from conservation footage. The territorial declaration of a Veshtari matriarch, the visual statement that says this ground is held, and I am the one who holds it. Behind her, the pack arranged itself without instruction. The 4 breeding-age males took positions along the rim, spaced evenly, their bodies oriented outward. The subadults gathered behind them. The juveniles clustered in the center, near the thermal springs, pressed close to the 2 elders who would guard them. Keth took a position at the matriarch's right flank, the traditional guardian station, the place that in pack hierarchy was reserved for the male the matriarch trusted most to hold the line beside her. Cade stood at the valley floor below them and watched the pack organize itself for a fight it should not have to endure. Behind him, Elara finished positioning the cameras. Her satellite uplink was live, broadcasting to the Heritage Commission archive, the regional judicial authority, and 4 conservation networks that had been notified of the Article 9 filing. The survey column arrived at mid-morning. 3 armored personnel carriers, a geological mapping vehicle, and an escort of 8 soldiers under Major Drace's direct command. They stopped at the valley's northern access road, a mining track that crossed the ridgeline and descended toward the overlook where the matriarch stood. Cade walked up the valley slope to meet them. He wore his field uniform, the conservation liaison variant, no rank insignia, no sidearm. His medic pack was on his back. His hands were empty and visible. Drace stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was younger than Cade, early 40s, career track, the crisp uniform and precise bearing of an officer who had not yet learned that the institution he served was capable of being wrong. "Marin, you have been relieved of conservation duties. Step aside." "I am not here in a conservation capacity, sir. I am here as voice of the pack under Article 9 of the Heritage Compact. The Veshtari Northern Range Pack has extended formal recognition, and I have filed a claim with the Heritage Commission. This valley is under active legal protection pending independent tribunal review." Article 9 is a historical curiosity. It has no operational standing. Article 9 has never been repealed, sir. It carries the force of treaty law. The Heritage Commission has acknowledged receipt of the filing and confirmed that an independent tribunal will convene. Any action taken against the pack or its recognized representative before the tribunal rules constitutes a violation of the compact. Drace looked past Cade at the ridgeline, where the matriarch stood with her wings spread and 19 dragons arrayed behind her. His expression shifted, not fear, not hesitation, but the particular discomfort of a man who has been told his authority is absolute and is looking at evidence to the contrary. You're standing in front of an armored column with a medic pack and a legal brief, Marin. This is Brecon Pass all over again. Yes, sir, it is. The soldiers behind Drace were looking at the ridgeline. Cade could see their faces. The young corporal in the second vehicle who had not signed up to clear nesting sites. The sergeant by the mapping vehicle who was old enough to know what a Veshtari matriarch's territorial display meant. The private who was staring at the juveniles clustered around the thermal springs and looking like he was reconsidering his enlistment. Then the matriarch sang. It began as a single tone, the deep, resonant note that Cade had first heard when Keth's breathing cleared, amplified now by the matriarch's full vocal range and the natural acoustics of the valley walls. The basalt amplified it, shaped it, turned the valley into a resonance chamber that made the sound physical, a vibration that pressed against the chest, hummed in the teeth, shivered through the armored hulls of the personnel carriers. Keth answered, then the breeding males, then the subadults, each voice finding its harmonic position in a chord that had evolved over 1,400 years of pack vocal tradition. The sound built not louder but deeper, more complex, a living architecture of interlocking tones that said this is our territory and we are here, and we have been here longer than your roads and your machines and your reports that call us hostile fauna. And then, from the forest beyond the valley, from the ridgelines to the east, and the canyons to the south, and the deep thermal valleys that the mining survey had not yet reached, other voices answered. 3 packs, then 5, then more than Cade could count, distant voices rising from every direction, responding to the matriarch's call with the recognition chorus, the Veshtari territorial response that said, we hear you and we stand with you. The sound rolled across the landscape like weather, like the voice of the land itself, remembering what had been done to it and deciding, collectively, that it had tolerated enough. Drace's soldiers had stopped moving. The corporal in the second vehicle had his hands on the steering column and was not advancing. The sergeant by the mapping vehicle had taken a step backward, not in retreat, but in the instinctive recoil of a human body confronted with a sound that registers below conscious hearing and speaks directly to the part of the brain that understands it is in the presence of something vast. Elara's cameras recorded everything. The satellite uplink carried the cord to the Heritage Commission, where 3 tribunal judges listened in their chambers and understood that what they were hearing was not 19 dragons defending a valley. It was every remaining Veshtari pack on the continent declaring, in the oldest language they possessed, that the matriarch's claim was theirs. Major Drace stood beside his vehicle and looked at the ridgeline for a long time. The chord continued, sustained, patient, enormous. The matriarch had not moved. Her copper eyes were fixed on the column below, and her wings were spread in the full territorial display, and her voice carried the lowest, deepest note of the chord. Pull back, Drace said quietly. Pull the column back. The corporal looked at him. Sir. I said pull back, corporal. We are not engaging a heritage site under active legal protection with a recognized voice of the pack on record, and every Veshtari pack in the northern range within vocal response distance. He paused. Mark the site as contested. File for guidance from regional command. We are done here. The column reversed. The vehicles turned on the narrow mining track and withdrew over the ridgeline, and the sound of their engines faded into the forest, and the cord continued for 3 minutes after they were gone, a coda, a declaration, a statement that did not require an audience to be true. The tribunal convened 11 days later. Elara presented the documentation, Cade's field recordings, the Matriarch's recognition tone analysis, the medical records of the PAC's treatment, the photographic evidence of recovery, the Article 9 filing, and the full recording of the confrontation. The mining consortium's legal team argued that Article 9 was obsolete, that PAC recognition of a human did not constitute legal standing, and that the reclassification had followed proper procedure. The tribunal deliberated for 6 hours. The 3 judges reviewed the field recordings in sequence: the Matriarch's first warning vibration, the feeding sessions, the surgical procedure on Keth, the recognition tone, and finally the full territorial cord that had rolled across the northern range and silenced an armored column. The senior judge, a woman who had adjudicated heritage disputes for 3 decades, listened to the recognition tone recording 4 times before setting down her headset and looking at the mining consortium's legal team with an expression that needed no translation. The tribunal ruled unanimously. The Veshtari Northern Range, both the original gorge and the adjacent valley, was redesignated as protected heritage territory under the original compact provisions. The mining reclassification was voided on procedural grounds. Article 9 was affirmed as active law, and Cade's status as voice of the PAC was entered into the heritage register. The mining company appealed. The appeal was denied. The company withdrew from the Northern Range entirely when the cost of litigation exceeded the projected mineral yield by a factor of 3, and the 3 other Veshtari PACs that had answered the Matriarch's cord filed their own territorial claims through newly recognized voices, conservation workers and field researchers who had been granted PAC recognition in the weeks following the confrontation. Cade stayed in the valley. Not because he was ordered to. His military career ended formally 2 weeks after the tribunal, with a quiet discharge that carried neither honor nor dishonor, just the bureaucratic acknowledgement that a man and an institution had finished needing each other. He stayed because the Matriarch expected him to stay, and because 19 dragons had arranged their lives around the assumption that the human who slept on the stone and carried the medic pack and smelled of burned gel and nutrient bars would be there when morning came. He built a shelter against the valley's southern wall, near the thermal vents, stone and salvaged timber, insulated with the same polymer sheeting he had used for Keth's splints. It was small, functional, and warmer than any barracks he had slept in during 26 years of service. Elara helped him install a permanent satellite uplink and a small solar array, and she visited monthly with supplies, medical equipment, and the legal updates that continued to arrive as the Article 9 precedent rippled outward through the conservation framework. Torin arrived 6 weeks after the tribunal. He was 23, the young corporal from the survey column, the one who had sat in the second vehicle with his hands on the steering column and had not advanced. He came in civilian clothes, carrying a pack that looked like it had been assembled from a military surplus catalog, and a determination that Cade recognized immediately, because he had seen it in his own mirror 26 years ago. "I resigned my commission," Torin said. "I want to learn how to do what you do. The sitting, the waiting, the whatever it is that makes them trust you." Cade looked at him for a long time. "It's not a technique. It's not a skill set. It's a decision you make about what matters more than your comfort, and then you sit with the consequences until they stop being consequences and start being your life." "I can do that." "We'll see." Cade handed him a nutrient bar. "Start with Tal, she's the curious one, don't reach for her, let her come to you. And be ready to sit for a very long time, because patience is the only language they trust." Torin sat. Tal approached after 40 minutes, faster than she had come to Cade, which meant something about the young man's calm, or about the pack's expanding definition of what a safe human looked like. She sniffed his hands, his boots, the nutrient bar he held. She took the food. She did not bolt. Months passed. The valley settled into rhythms that Cade learned to read the way he had once read tactical briefings. The Matriarch's morning circuits of the perimeter, Keth's afternoon patrols along the corridor, the juveniles' daily migration between the thermal pools and the fern groves, where they played elaborate chasing games that looked like chaos but were, Elara explained, a sophisticated form of flight training encoded in social play. The subadult's wing healed fully. She took her first flight from the valley rim on a morning so clear that the sky looked like blue glass, and she flew in widening circles above the thermal updrafts, her repaired membrane catching the light, the copper edging of her adult scales beginning to show along her flanks. The elder's shoulder wound closed under fresh scales that grew in darker than the originals, a scar signature that would mark him for life, a record written in his own body of what had been done to him and what had healed. Other packs visited, not to fight. The territorial court had established the valley's boundaries and the Matriarch's authority, but to observe. They came in twos and threes, cautious, staying at the ridgeline, watching the human who lived among the Veshtari with the frank curiosity of creatures who had heard something unprecedented and wanted to verify it with their own senses. The Matriarch tolerated their presence the way a landowner tolerates neighbors who stay on their side of the fence, with watchful patience and the implicit understanding that courtesy is a two-way arrangement. One morning, 3 months after the tribunal, Cade sat on his usual stone near the thermal springs, writing his daily field notes in the battered journal that had replaced the official conservation reports he no longer had authority to file. The Matriarch lay beside him, not across from him, not watching from a distance beside him, her enormous body curved along the stone so that her flank pressed against his left side, her scales warm against his arm through his field jacket. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing was deep and slow. The recognition hum rolled through her chest, barely audible, felt more than heard, a vibration that passed through the stone and through his body and settled into the frequency of his own heartbeat. Tal was asleep on his feet. Keth dozed 5 meters away, his breath strong, his ribs healed, his new scales dark and gleaming. Torin sat across the springs with 2 juveniles investigating his pack straps, his face wearing the expression of a man who has discovered that his purpose was waiting for him in a place he had not thought to look. Cade set down his pen. He leaned against the Matriarch's flank, feeling the heat of her through his jacket, listening to the hum that had become as familiar as his own breathing. The valley was warm and quiet and full of dragons, and the morning light fell across the thermal springs in bars of gold, and somewhere in the forest beyond the ridgeline, other packs were stirring in their own valleys, and the world was neither safe nor kind. But it was, in this place and in this hour, exactly what it should be. He closed his eyes, the Matriarch hummed. The stone was warm beneath him. He had not saved them. That was the thing people would get wrong later, when the Article 9 case became precedent, and the story traveled through conservation circles and acquired the simplified shape that all stories acquire when they are told enough times. He had not saved them. He had sat down in a gorge with a medic kit and the willingness to be still, and they had saved themselves. And somewhere in the middle of that process, they had decided he was worth keeping. Some things were simple. The Matriarch's hum deepened, and the morning was warm, and Cade Marin, insubordinate, discharged, 49 years old, with titanium pins in his knee and a flag on his file, and the trust of 19 dragons who had taught him what it meant to stand for something, sat on a stone in a valley that would be there long after the roads and the reports and the men who wrote them were forgotten, and was, for the first time in 26 years, exactly where he belonged.